What if I told you that Iran, the country we know today, plays a super important role in the stories of the Bible and in what happens in the world? Everyone talks about Israel, Egypt, and Babylon, but Iran, which in the Bible was called Persia, is not just another empire. It has a specific role in God's prophecies for the chosen people. The history of Iran in the Bible begins with Noah, then continues with Cyrus the Great, who was an important Persian king. Iran, or Persia, was not just another empire, but a nation that God used to free the Israelites from Babylon, rebuild the temple, and fulfill promises that were made long ago. What you are going to learn today will surprise you. You will understand how Iran is linked to key moments in the Bible, from the time of Noah to the visions of the future that the Bible tells us. Take advantage and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss new videos on the channel. Keep going. The Iranian people have very ancient roots, linked to the family of Japheth, one of Noah's sons. They grew up in the region that is now Iran, and over time, they formed the Persian Empire, which was super powerful. This empire was responsible for some of the most important events in biblical history. The Persian Empire not only conquered Babylon, but also helped free the Israelites and helped them rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This happened with a decree of Cyrus, who was chosen by God even before he was born. He was God's instrument to carry out what he planned for Israel. In the book of Esther, we see another way in which God used Persia to protect the people of Israel. When the Persian king almost exterminated the Jews, Esther, a Jewish woman who became queen, took a great risk to save her people. This moment is celebrated by Jews to this day. And it is not only the past that matters. The Bible also speaks about Iran in visions of the future. In the book of Ezekiel, for example, there is a prophecy that speaks of a great battle at the end of time, in which Iran, Persia, will be one of the countries involved. Even today, Iran has a huge influence on the world, and the Bible already spoke about its role in the future. So, even with everything that has happened throughout history, Iran has an important role in a much larger plan that comes from God, which involves all countries and empires, and which will one day be fulfilled. It is incredible to think how Iran, a country far removed from God's covenant with Israel, was and will be part of this grand plan. Now, more than ever, we must see Iran not only as a modern country, but as part of a great mystery that God is unraveling in the history of the world. The Bible teaches us that God has a purpose for everything, and Iran, or Persia, is a fundamental piece in this great puzzle. And do you know what else is interesting? The Bible also mentions that Iran, or Persia, will continue to be an important part of events in the future. In the book of Daniel, for example, we see several visions of empires that would dominate the world. Persia, represented by a bear, was a strong empire that would change the course of history. Furthermore, in the book of Daniel, there is a vision of a ram with two horns, one representing the Medes and the other the Persians, symbolizing the strength of this union. But it doesn't stop there. One of the most remarkable stories in the Bible is the visit of the Magi to the baby Jesus. Many scholars believe that these wise men were from the region of Persia, and with that, Persia also has a connection with the birth of Christ. Even after the fall of the Persian Empire, its spiritual and cultural influence continued to be felt, especially when it came to wisdom and the search for signs in the sky. Another important point is that Persia was always an empire that respected the different cultures and religions of the people it ruled. This behavior had a great impact on the future, especially on later empires, such as the Roman. This attitude of respect and religious freedom helped the Jewish communities to spread, and with that, the gospel had the chance to spread as well. And finally, when we talk about the future, in Ezekiel, we find a prophecy that speaks of Persia, modern Iran, joining other nations in a great battle against Israel at the end of time. This shows us that Iran will still be part of the fulfillment of promises made by God. The battle mentioned is known as the War of Gog and Magog, and the future of this battle will be a defining moment in the last days. What does this teach us? That the history of Iran, or Persia, is much more than just a historical episode. It is part of a larger plan that God has for the world, and we are seeing these prophecies fulfilled before our eyes. God is sovereign over all nations, and even the most powerful, such as Persia and Iran today, are part of this divine plan. So as we look at the events of the modern world, especially between Iran and Israel, we need to remember that it is all part of a much larger story that began in the pages of the Bible and will ultimately be fulfilled. Iran, like Persia, plays an important role in what God has planned for the future of the world, and it is essential that we understand how it fits into this divine plan. The history of Iran teaches us that even in times of great conflict, God is still in control, and His will be accomplished, no matter how unlikely the nations may seem. As we delve deeper into biblical prophecy and look at the role of Iran, or Persia, we see that it is not just a historical actor, but a key player in the scenes that are yet to come. The Bible speaks of how nations will rise up against Israel, and Iran, as part of this scenario, will be one of the protagonists in a great battle in the future. This event, known as the War of Gog and Magog, mentioned in Ezekiel, is described as a final showdown between good and evil, with Israel at the center of the conflict. The fact that Iran, Persia, is a central part of this prophecy reinforces the idea that it has a spiritual role in God's grand plan for the end times. Many believe that the events we are seeing today, such as the tensions between Iran and Israel, are just pieces that fit together in a much larger and deeper puzzle. The Bible has already warned us about these times, and now we are living in times that may align with these prophetic outcomes. But the interesting thing is that, even though we are talking about a great battle and challenges that are yet to come, the Bible also teaches us something very important about how God acts in history. He is in control of all nations. Even though empires, like the Persian Empire, have risen and fallen over time, God has always been and will always be guiding these events to fulfill His plans. Iran, like Persia in the past, has a role that goes beyond what we see in the news. It has been used by God to protect His people in the past and will be used again in the future. And perhaps most importantly, the Bible reminds us that no nation, no matter how big or small, is outside of God's control. Everything that happens has a greater purpose, and in the end, all historical events will culminate in the fulfillment of God's promises. So when we think about Iran today, it is important to view the country not only through the lens of politics or the daily news, but also from a deeper, biblical perspective. Iran plays a role in God's grand plan for the redemption of the world, and this reminds us that human history is not a series of accidents, but a narrative guided by God that will ultimately bring salvation and the fulfillment of His promises. Therefore, as we observe current events and the tensions between Iran and Israel, we must remember that we are witnessing parts of a story that began in the Bible and is unfolding before our eyes. Every kingdom, every empire, and every leader has a role in God's plan, and in the end, God's sovereignty will be evident to all. Iran, like Persia, continues to be an important piece of this grand plot that points to the redemption of Israel and the world, and the fulfillment of God's promises. As we look to the future and reflect on biblical prophecy, it is clear that Iran, like Persia in the past, plays a crucial role in the events yet to come. The Bible not only tells us about what has happened, but also gives us clues about what will happen. And Iran, as part of this narrative, is deeply involved in the outcome of the entire story. The War of Gog and Magog, mentioned in Ezekiel 38-39, is one of the most notable prophecies about Iran's future role. In this war, a coalition of nations will unite against Israel, and Iran will be one of the main allies in this coalition. This final war, which involves forces of evil opposing God's people, promises to be an epic showdown, with Israel at the center of the conflict. While the exact details of when and how this will happen are debated, the prophecy is clear: Iran will play a key role. This shows us that while we see Iran as a modern country with its own political agenda, it is also part of a divine plan that transcends any human action. The history of Israel, nations, and empires is much more than a simple succession of events. It is part of a larger prophetic picture that God is slowly revealing. What we must understand most is that for God, no empire, no matter how powerful, is beyond His control. The Bible teaches us that He can raise up nations and tear them down when the time is right. Iran, like Persia before it, was raised up by God to accomplish His purposes, and this goes far beyond political relations or military battles. Even in times of great conflict and hardship, God continues to work through nations to accomplish His plan of salvation. As we reflect on Iran and its prophetic role, it is essential to remember that we are living in a time when these prophecies may be coming to pass. The conflict between Iran and Israel is just one manifestation of this great divine plan that is unfolding. Therefore, it is important to look at the world with a broader view, understanding that events are not just the result of a political or religious struggle, but are part of a much larger plan, guided by the sovereign hand of God. In the years ahead, as these events unfold, it will become even more evident that Iran's role, like that of other nations, is embedded in a story that began in Scripture and will end in the fulfillment of God's promises. God's sovereignty over nations, as we have seen throughout history, is key to understanding the events of the present and the battles of the future. God not only allows but uses even the most unlikely nations to accomplish his purposes, and Iran, even as a nation with a controversial role today, will continue to be part of that divine plan. Therefore, as we reflect on the history of Persia and Iran, we must remember that God's story with the nations is much larger than the wars and disputes we see today. It is a story of redemption, a plan that began in the Old Testament, continued through the birth and life of Jesus, and will culminate in the fulfillment of God's promises at the end of time. Iran, like Persia before it, plays a vital role in this story, and by understanding that role, we can look to the future with greater clarity and hope for what God is yet to prepare. As we continue to explore Iran's, or Persia's, role in biblical prophecy, it is important to note that Iran's story does not end with the events of the past. The country, which has deep roots in the Bible, continues to play a significant role in God's plans for the future. And as we have seen in Scripture, God does not choose nations at random. He raises them up to fulfill his purpose, and Iran is clearly included in that purpose. The prophecy of the war of Gog and Magog, as mentioned in Ezekiel 38-39, points to a final confrontation in which the forces of evil will rise against Israel in the last days, with Iran as a key participant. This war will be a decisive event in the struggle between good and evil, with God's people Israel at the center of this conflict. While the specific details of this battle are still uncertain, the Bible assures us that Iran will play a central role, being part of a coalition of nations that will challenge God's plans for his people. This scenario challenges us to see Iran in a different way than we usually do. Although Iran is a nation with its own history and politics, the Bible teaches us that behind human actions there is a divine plan being fulfilled. Iran, like Persia of old, is not just playing a political role, but is involved in a great cosmic drama that will unfold at the end of time. This reminds us that world history is not a series of coincidences or isolated disputes, but a sequence of events guided by the sovereign hand of God. Furthermore, the Bible teaches us that even when everything seems out of control, God is working through nations to accomplish his purposes. The rise and fall of empires, as we saw in the story of Persia, shows us that God can use any nation, even the most unlikely, to accomplish his will. Iran, which today is a nation with significant influence in the Middle East, has played this role before, as we saw in the restoration of the people of Israel, and it will continue to do so in the future. What does this mean for us today? It means that the events we see unfolding in the Middle East, especially as they relate to Iran and Israel, are part of a larger narrative that began in the pages of the Bible and will continue to unfold until the end of time. The current conflict is not just a political dispute, it is an important piece of God's grand plan for the redemption of the world. And understanding this can help us look to the future with deeper perspective and greater confidence that God's plan will ultimately be fulfilled. As we look at Iran in its biblical and prophetic significance, we must remember that, like all nations, it is under God's control. He will use even the most unlikely nations to accomplish his purposes. Iran, now at the center of the world stage, has a role that goes beyond current politics. It is involved in a divine plan that will culminate in the fulfillment of God's promises for his people and the world. Ultimately, Iran, or Persia, teaches us that no matter how much nations change, God's sovereignty is constant. Everything that happens, large or small, has a greater purpose. And what we are seeing now in the Middle East, especially in the context of Iran, is part of a much larger story, a story of redemption that God is writing that will culminate in the coming of his kingdom. By understanding Iran's prophetic role and its impact on biblical history, we can see world history with new eyes, eyes that remind us that it is all being orchestrated by God, and that his will be done. As we continue to examine the role of Iran, Persia, in biblical prophecy, we can see that there is a continuity between historical events and prophetic visions. What Iran is experiencing today, and the role it plays in geopolitical tensions, is in fact a repetition of a pattern established millennia ago. Biblical prophecy teaches us that God is in control of all nations and events, and this includes Iran, which, even in its modern form, continues to be part of God's plan. Iran, as one of the nations mentioned in the War of Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 38-39, represents the role of a nation that, despite its human actions and intentions, is inserted into a larger narrative. Even though Iran is a self-interested actor on a political and military level, the Bible reminds us that God uses all nations, even those outside of his chosen people, to accomplish his greater plan. Ultimately, all nations, including Iran, will serve God's purpose, whether consciously or unconsciously. The future of Iran, as outlined in Scripture, is deeply intertwined with the history of Israel, and as we look at the world scene, especially the interactions between Iran and Israel, we can see that the events we are experiencing are not just the result of a common political conflict. They are part of a prophetic story that will be fulfilled, and that reveals how God is in control of everything from past empires to current events. The book of Daniel, in particular, highlights how the rise and fall of empires, such as Persia, are part of a divine plan that unfolds over time. Daniel's visions of empires, especially the Persian Empire, remind us that the history of nations is not random or accidental, but a sequence of events predestined to fulfill God's purposes. This gives us a new perspective on modern politics and helps us understand how great powers, including Iran, are connected to a deeper spiritual narrative. Furthermore, the prophecy about the rise of an empire to replace Persia, represented by Greece, and how the history of subsequent empires will continue until the end of time, also reminds us that the end of days is near. Since Iran, Persia, played a vital role in the restoration of Israel and the protection of God's people in the past, it will play a crucial role in future events, even if in ways that we are still beginning to understand. Indeed, the central message of all these prophecies is that even as we look at the modern world and see conflict and tension, there is an unseen hand guiding it all. God, in His sovereignty, allows nations to rise and fall, but everything that happens, whether in the present or in the future, accomplishes His purposes. Iran, as a modern nation, is just one more piece of this great tapestry, and its role in the end times will be part of the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises to Israel and the world. So as we look at the news about Iran and its relationship with other nations, especially Israel, we must remember that we are watching an ancient story unfold, one that began in the pages of the Bible and that connects to the future. Iran, like Persia before it, has a much deeper role than we realize, and its history and future are intertwined with a divine plan that will ultimately be fulfilled. God uses even the most unlikely nations to accomplish His will, and by understanding Iran's role, we can see more clearly how He is working on the world stage. Ultimately, as we reflect on Iran's role, we must keep in mind that everything is moving toward the fulfillment of the prophecies that point to the coming of God's kingdom. Iran, with its history and modern influence, is a reminder that God has a plan for all nations, and that ultimately, victory will be His. This gives us hope and calls us to live with the assurance that God's plan will be fulfilled, no matter what challenges the world may face. As we continue to observe global events and their relationship to biblical prophecy, it is important to remember that Iran's role is not limited to today's political or military interactions. The history of Persia and Iran reminds us that no matter how complex events may seem, they are part of a larger narrative that God has already written. As we have seen in Scripture, God uses even the most powerful and unlikely empires to accomplish His plans. Iran's relationship with Israel and the other empires mentioned in biblical prophecy teaches us an important lesson. Nations are not outside of God's control. Although Iran has a history of rivalry with Israel, the Bible reminds us that this conflict has a divine purpose. What we are seeing in the present, such as Iran's involvement in events in the Middle East, is only part of God's grand plan that unfolds throughout history. Ezekiel's prophecies about the war of Gog and Magog, for example, point to a great battle in the future that will be decisive for the fate of Israel and the nations. Even more surprising is the way the Bible reveals that God used nations outside of Israel's covenant, such as Persia, to accomplish His plan of salvation. The example of Cyrus the Great as God's anointed to deliver the people of Israel from Babylonian captivity is a clear reminder that God can use any nation, no matter how unlikely it may seem, to fulfill His promises. And this, in the context of modern Iran, suggests that He will continue to use it, whether to fulfill past promises or to act in the future. What does this tell us about Iran's present and future? First, we must understand that the ongoing events in the Middle East, including the tensions between Iran and Israel, are part of a larger picture involving the fulfillment of God's promises. While we may not understand all the details of how this will unfold, we can be assured that God is working behind the scenes, guiding all nations toward the ultimate fulfillment of His plan. The Bible has warned us of end-time conflicts, and Iran, as a former Persian nation, has a key role to play in this scenario. Moreover, we must remember that while the political and military battles are happening before our eyes, the real spiritual battle is taking place behind the scenes. Iran, which was used by God to deliver Israel from Babylon, will also be a key player in the future events leading up to the return of Christ and the fulfillment of prophecies about Israel's restoration and ultimate victory over the forces of evil. Biblical prophecy shows us that even when things seem out of control, God has a bigger picture. He is in control, and all nations, including Iran, are acting within the confines of His sovereign plan. This gives us a deeper perspective on the events unfolding today and helps us see that in the end, God will be victorious and his plan of salvation will be fulfilled. Therefore, as we reflect on Iran and its role in biblical prophecy, we need to keep in mind that the story of Persia is much more than a story of the past. Iran, like Persia before it, is part of a greater divine plot that continues to unfold. What we are seeing today, with the tensions in the Middle East, is just one part of the larger story that God is writing. Ultimately, we must live with the assurance that no matter what happens in the world, God's sovereignty is paramount. Iran, like all nations, is part of God's grand plan for humanity, and every event, every conflict, is contributing to the fulfillment of God's promises. The future of Iran, Israel, and the world is in God's hands, and, as Scripture assures us, He will fulfill His plan to the end. This gives us hope and confidence, knowing that we are part of a story greater than we can see, and that in the end, God will have the ultimate victory. As we move forward, it is essential to reflect on how all of this applies to the present moment. When we see the news about Iran and its challenges with Israel and other nations, it is easy to get lost in the complexities of modern politics. However, the Bible invites us to look beyond what is visible and understand that these tensions are part of a greater plan that God has established since ancient times. Iran, as part of ancient Persia, has played a pivotal role in defining moments in Israel's history. As we have seen previously, God used Persia to fulfill promises that were recorded in the prophecies of generations past. Cyrus the Great was a clear example of how God can use even the most unlikely rulers to accomplish His purposes, and this gives us greater insight into how He may continue to use nations in the future, including Iran. Furthermore, the prophecies of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Isaiah, which speak of the role of nations in the last days, are not just words from the distant past but of ongoing relevance. The fact that Iran is involved in end-time prophecies such as the War of Gog and Magog reminds us that the country has a part to play in fulfilling God's plan for the redemption of humanity. The struggle between good and evil, which is vividly described in Scripture, will be a battle that will feature Iran, along with other nations, as key players, and this should give us pause for thought about the importance of prayer and being attentive to what is unfolding on the world stage. While the details of this final battle are not yet clear, we know that Iran, like all other nations, is in a God-given role. When we look at history, we see that no empire, even the most powerful, is beyond God's control. The same God who used Persia to restore the temple in Jerusalem and protect the people of Israel, can and will use Iran and other nations for His ultimate purposes. This understanding that everything has a greater purpose, guided by God's sovereignty, gives us confidence and helps us view world events in a more balanced way. We must not view tensions in the Middle East, or any other global conflict, solely through a political and social lens. We must remember that the story of humanity is a story of redemption, where God is actively working to fulfill His promises, and everything that happens, including current events, is part of that divine narrative. With this in mind, we must live with hope, knowing that even in the darkest hours, God has a plan in motion. He can use any nation, including Iran, to accomplish His purposes. We must remain vigilant and pray for wisdom, seeking to better understand each nation's role in the fulfillment of God's plan. The history of Iran, from its role in ancient Persia to its position on the world stage today, is a reminder that God not only knows the times and seasons, but is also actively involved in shaping them. He has used Persia in the past and will continue to use Iran in the future as He fulfills His promises to Israel and humanity. Ultimately, this understanding leads us to a powerful conclusion. History is not out of control, and world events are not accidental. They are part of an eternal plan of salvation, in which every nation, every leader, and every person has a role to play. Iran, like Persia before it, has an important place in that plan. And in the end, all will contribute to the glorious fulfillment of God's promises, where He will bring peace and justice to His people and to all creation. In conclusion, as we reflect on the role of Iran, or ancient Persia, in biblical prophecy, we realize that its history is not just a sequence of political and military events, but part of a larger divine plan. God, in His sovereignty, uses even the most unlikely nations to accomplish His purposes. Iran, throughout history, has been a crucial nation in the fulfillment of God's promises, and its role will continue to unfold in the future events described in Scripture. Iran, as part of today's global scene, reminds us that behind every political and social action, there is a divine purpose being fulfilled. The Bible teaches us that even in times of conflict and uncertainty, God's sovereignty is at work, leading nations toward the fulfillment of His promises of salvation and restoration. The conflict between Iran and Israel, as well as the prophecies of the War of Gog and Magog, are signs that history is approaching a culmination point where God's plan will finally be revealed. Therefore, as we look at Iran and global events, we must remember that everything is interconnected in God's grand plan. Every nation, every empire, and every event is part of a larger picture that will ultimately bring God's victory. As Christians, we should live with hope and confidence, knowing that God is in control and that He will ultimately fulfill His promises to Israel and the entire world. Iran's story is a reminder that nothing escapes God's control, and that He can use even the most challenging events to fulfill His eternal plan of redemption.